G mana na 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 no den G mana na 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 gi go G mana na 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 no den G mana na 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 gi go. What I just sang was a paddling song when we travel in the G-mon, or the canoe. And it says, my canoe is like a fish, my canoe is like the wind. And it's a song that we would sing when we traveled along the waters. And I think about that song as a way of sort of indicating that we're all on a journey. And that's part of this evening, is a journey together. And a journey together not just through this evening, but the thoughts and things that we carry from this conference, from this evening's dinner, from your experience here with me tonight, perhaps, or the experiences that you'll have yet throughout the day tomorrow. All of that is part of a journey. It's part of a continuing thing. And I like that song because it's something that people would all sing together as they were paddling, as they were traveling. My name is Frank Ettawageshik, or as I would introduce myself in our language, I would say, Pipigwa Ododem, Ettawageshik, Indijnakas, Waganuksing, and Donjaba. And I would say the sparrowhawk is the mark of my family. Noonday is my name, and I was born, or I live at the place of the Crooked Tree, which is north of here, along Little Traverse Bay, just to the north of that, up at the tip of the lower peninsula of Michigan, and on the Lake Michigan side. My tribe, the Waganuksing Odawa, or the Ottawa at the Crooked Tree Place, has lived in that area for hundreds of years and lived in the lakes for many, many, many years longer than that, for countless generations throughout the Great Lakes region. In order to talk a little about this, and you'll find that they asked me, did I want a mic, and how did I want it? Of course, I didn't want one on a stand. As you can tell, I'm wandering, and I find that someone told me if they tied my hands behind my back that I would almost be mute. Because I find I speak a great deal with my hands, and I find that I speak with my feet as well. Yeah. Perhaps I am. But I find that it's a good thing to know a little about the person who's speaking. And I was taught in a traditional way that it's important for us when we speak, not as a matter of bragging, but as a matter of letting people know sort of a little about us, to talk a little about ourselves or about our family, to sort of put what you're going to say in perspective. And so to do that, I found that it's helpful perhaps for me to do a little of my family tree and to tell you a little about myself and my family, and put these words that I'm going to speak this evening into context. And as I said, I'm Frank Ettawageshik. I'm a traditional artist. I'm a potter. I'm a storyteller. I ran a art gallery for many years. I'm also a political leader. I'm in my fourth term as an elected official for my tribe as the tribal chairman. I'm been involved in a whole lot of different other types of leadership. I work a lot I'm on the board of directors for a number of different boards throughout the area. Little Traverse Conservancy. I was on the board for the tip of the Watershed Council for a while. I serve on an Arts Council board. I'm one of Michigan's 2 representatives to the Board of Advisors for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. I wear a number of different hats. In fact, I wear so many hats sometimes I think I'm losing my hair a little, because I keep changing them all the time. But, and I have children that I've taught and are still teaching the stories and some of the traditional ways. My wife and I, Rochelle, we live up in Harbor Springs, Michigan, which is right in that area of the Crooked Tree, that area that was called the Crooked Tree. Now, my father was born in 1896, It was Fred Ettawageshik, and he was born also in that area in Harbor Springs, Michigan, up on that Lake Michigan side, up on Little Traverse Bay of the northern tip of the lower peninsula of Michigan. My father, one of the things that was really important in his life was he went to the Indian boarding schools, and there was a school right there. In fact, they're just about to tear the building down right now after several decades of not being used. But it's a Holy Childhood boarding school, and there were Indian students who came from all over the Great Lakes area to go to school there. It was run by the Catholic Church. And my father was one of the people in town. He was a day student. He went to school there, would walk to school and back each day. And he later went on to Mount Pleasant, Michigan, which is right about in the center of the lower peninsula of Michigan, and went to the Indian boarding school there. When he was there, he didn't come home as often. He came out through the summers, but he would just maybe once or twice in the school year, he might get a chance to come home. Well, then he went on to school at Carlisle. The Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, some of you may have seen the stories about this. This is the famous first of the Indian boarding schools that was put together by the Army, by the War Department. And they were trying to figure out how to civilize the Indians, how to take the Indian out of the Indian. And they felt the only way to save us was to take us in these places and cut our hair. We were in uniforms. We'd march from class to class, and we would be punished if we spoke the Indian language. We were taught a variety of things. My father played Dixieland jazz on a clarinet, which is not what you usually think of for a tribal leader. And he was a public speaker. He did storytelling, but he also ran a Boy Scout camp and was a Boy Scout executive and did a number of things throughout his life. He, unlike many of the students who went to boarding schools, he didn't lose the language, and he didn't leave the culture, but he ended up coming home and became one of the leaders in the community. And he ran an Indian arts and crafts business that I grew up learning when I was 8 years old. I knew how to make change and wait on customers. And unlike many of the people today, you go to Kmart, and if they have a power failure, they can't count your change back. Well, we used to, I learned how to do that when I was 8 and learned how to be in business. Now, my grandfather, Joseph Ettawageshik, was born in 1863. Also in that same town of Harbor Springs, but at the time it was called Little Traverse. And he was, of course, he was involved there in the community at the time that school was there. He was a businessman. He had an Indian Businessman's Association. I have a little notebook at home from my grandfather, and in it, on one page, it's got all of the people running for office in the different parties and the townships and things. The next page is a list of how much people owed him for the wood that he'd cut. Full cords of wood at, I think $2 a cord. Those are those 8 by 8 foot, piles of wood for fire for your house. And he did that, but on the next page would be a recipe for ketchup, for instance. And it's one of those eclectic collections of things that really help you understand that person. And I value that a great deal because my grandfather died before I was born. And this is a way for me to know more about him. He was one of the leaders in the community and was looked to for naming ceremonies, and started an Indian arts and crafts business in Harbor Springs that my father continued until he retired in 1963. My grandfather started it in 1903. Now, my great-grandfather was also born in that same town, Little Traverse, a Mabel Ettawageshik. He was born about 1839. And in his life, he was a tailor. He was a township clerk. People say, now this is 1839 and trying to figure all this out. He was part of a generation of our leaders in our tribal communities here in Michigan that we had to have a strategy how to stay in our homeland. because we were in the way. And they wanted us to be moved, and so they sent Indian agents amongst us, like Henry Schoolcraft and others, who collected the data about our culture and wrote down our stories and different life ways and everything. But the primary purpose was to try to show that we were essentially, that it would not in our interest, that we weren't assimilating, it wouldn't be in our interest to stick around and to make a justification for moving us to Kansas or to Oklahoma or to other places. And our leaders, of course, didn't care much for that and tried to figure out strategies on how we could stay. Well, one of the ways they did that is not only did we keep our traditional form of government that was happening in our councils, but we also started having our educated young people put them in positions like in township governments, and we started having a parallel non-Indian government. Before there were a lot of white folks in our midst, we actually had incorporated as townships and counties, and we were in those areas. We were doing everything we can as a strategy in order to stay. Well, my great-grandfather, Ettawageshik, was one of those people who had become a township clerk, township treasurer, and he, as I said, he ran a tailoring. He was a tailor. He'd learned in the Indian school how to be a tailor. Now, my great-great-grandfather, he was born about 1811 or so, Paul Ettawageshik. And when he was born, he was given a name, and that name was Ettawageshik, which means the meeting of the night and the day. And he was born not in Little Traverse, but he was born, 15 miles or so up the shore, at a place that today, if you look at a map, you'll see there's a town called Goodhart, H-A-R-T. It is actually misspelled. It should be H-E-A-R-T, but they spelled it Goodhart. It was named after one of my great-uncles. And Goodhart is up on the bluff, and just down below the bluff, if you drive down the road below the bluff, along the water's edge, you find an old church down there, a Catholic church that is still used in the summer. And there's a sign there, and it's called a place, if you look on a map, it says Middle Village, and we called it Ettawageshik, or at the halfway place. And this was the center of a 16-mile-long village that went up and down along the shore. And along that shore, it was sometimes maybe a mile deep along the shore, or sometimes just a little bit. You could see from one group of lodges to the next. And there were upwards, in the summer months, there were upwards of 30,000 of us who lived there. We tell people in Emmett County that the county is just now reaching its former population. And they have a hard time believing that because they think it's getting really crowded right now. But this was the way that village was. This was where that village was that my great-great-grandfather, Ettawageshik, was. Well, he was christened in the church. He was given the name Paul. He became Paul Ettawageshik. He took his Indian name as his last name, and that's the source of our last name today. If you noticed when I introduced myself, I said Ettawageshik. That's my Indian name, Noonday. And so my traditional name is Ettawageshik, but I carry as a last name for all these years this name of my great-great-grandfather. And that's where our family name came from in this Western way of looking at names. Now, I've told you a little about this because I wanted you to understand some of the roots, some of these people, some of the things, these people who are part of my life and part of my whole sense of place, my sense of understanding who I am. But the first real story that I want to tell you this evening is the story about how my great-great-great-grandfather got his name. And it was at a time when we lived there. I told you about that big village where there were 30,000 of us that lived in the summers. Well, in the winters, we'd break into smaller groups. A bunch of brothers and their wives and children and others would sail off down the shore in the Jimon, in the canoes. And they would come down perhaps to the Grand River and come up the Grand River and camp maybe in this very area. Or they'd do into some of the other rivers and things all the way down as far as Jagagong. Jagag means skunk. Jagagong means place of the skunk, which is Chicago today, okay? Yes. Yeah, he says it still smells. So. But this, we would camp in those places. And then in the spring, we'd go into the sugar bush and make maple sugar. And then we go back in the Jimon in the canoes back to the main village of Waganukasing. And that was the way we'd travel back and forth. I like to think of my ancestors living in the north in the summer and going south in the winter as being the first resorters, you know. And of course, we lived in those areas that today is really highly prized real estate because it's on the shore, it's where the winds will blow all the bugs away, and it's really pleasant to live. And that today, those things sell for, $5,000-$6,000 a front foot on the water, And there are 30 and 40 room cottages on all those places where our villages used to be because they were such prized real estate along the lakes. And this is part of our ties to that whole issue of the Great Lakes, to the water, because we would travel on that water and others. But as we move in those traveling back and forth through the seasons, we travel in these Jimon. People think of the canoe or the Jimon as being, 3-4 people. You see these little canoes, but you got to imagine a canoe now that's big enough to hold, say, 25, 30 people. Now, I've paddled in these. We make them still today and use them. But a whole family would travel in one of these. And when you do that, one person is steering in the back, and the others are paddling on the sides. And you take turns periodically, from this. And whoever's going to be steering that Jimon as you travel. And it's really something when you're in that Jimon and you have all those people paddling, because when they do that and everybody strokes together as they're singing a song like that song I opened with, when everybody pushes and pulls just at that same time paddling, that canoe is just like flies. It's just really an amazing feeling, and you can't think this big thing with all the people in it, and yet it just flies across the water. It's really exciting. But it was on one of these trips down south along the water, down in the lake, near the area that we call Muskegon today, that there was one of these big Jimon traveling along, and this group of people, my relatives, were traveling, and there was this young man, a young man who would eventually become my great-great-great-grandfather. And it was his turn to steer. It was early in the day, and they were in that Jimon traveling along, and as they were moving along and just sort of flying through the water, that water was calm. Now, you've all seen that big lake when it's calm. There's just a gentle little swell. It's like a mirror. You can see that. And that water was like that, and they were just flying along. And, of course, steering the canoe is not the most difficult of the jobs, and so you would switch off. So that young man, who became my great-great-great-grandfather, he switched off, and someone else started steering the canoe, and he was paddling. And just shortly after that, the waves started coming up, and it started getting rough. And now, you know how that big lake can get like that, and it got very rough. And as they were moving along all the rest of that day, no matter which of those people were steering that Jimon, that canoe, the weather was rough, and they had a hard time making headway. And finally, became towards the end of the day, and they pulled up on shore, and they pulled that big Jimon up, and they sort of tipped it on its side a little out of the waves, and they took out some long poles that they carry in there, set them up in a little lean-to, almost like a little teepee, but it was pretty short. And then they took out some mats that they carried in there, and they unrolled them. These mats are made of rushes that we weave together, and you took those and wrapped them around those poles and made a shelter for the night. And after they did that, they ate a little food, and then as they were sort of getting ready to rest for the night, one of the older gentlemen, and sometimes how us older folks sometimes have a way of teasing those young ones, well, that young man, he must have been 14, 15 years old or so, that one who was going to become my great-great-great-grandfather. They were looking at him, and that old fella came over to him and said to him, "Now, why is it," he said, "whenever you're steering that canoe? The weather's so fine, and when everybody else is steering, it's so bad. Why is that? Well, that young man surprised him because he said, I had a dream, he said. I had a dream, and in my dream, I was steering the G-Man as we were moving along. He said, and then I looked and I noticed there was only one other man in that canoe with me. Only one other person sitting in the front of that canoe, and we're flying along through the water. And then I looked, he said, and I noticed that that was no ordinary man, because he just sort of floated there in the front of that canoe. He floated there like a red butterfly, he said. They're floating in the front of that canoe, and we were just flying along. And he said, and that's the end of my dream. Well, everybody said, oh, miigwech, thank you for telling us that. And then they all went to sleep. Now, the next day, when they got up, they folded up rolled those mats up, put them down in that G-Man. They took those poles and put those poles together and put them in there. And as they were getting ready to go out on the water, that older man came over to that young man and brought him a pinch of tobacco in his hand and put that tobacco in that young man's hand and said to him, now we do this same thing to this very day. As a matter of fact, here's a little tobacco tie right here, a little piece of cloth with some tobacco in it. I, as a tribal leader, always keep these in my pocket because I may need someone to say grace, for instance, at a meal, and I'll go and ask. I usually ask the eldest woman in the audience if she would, in the group there at the meal, if she would say a grace. She can decline if she wishes, and then I'll ask others until I get someone who agrees, and then they'll take that tobacco, and it's a sign of respect that we do that. It's one of our sacred herbs, but it's almost like a contract. In Indian country, we say if you take that tobacco, you've made a pledge or a promise that you're going to do whatever it was that you were asked. Well, that old man, he took that tobacco, that pinch, and he put that in that young man's hand, and he said to him, Miskwo Memingwan, red butterfly, come, steer our canoe and bring us good weather. And from that day forward, that's the name that young man carried. And if you look on the Treaty of 1836, and you look in the list of the chiefs that signed that treaty, you'll see Miskwo Memingwan. My great-great-great-grandfather was one of those people. And that's a naming story from my family. There are similar kinds of stories for lots of others, but I wanted you to understand a little about some of the roots that we have here, those roots that deal with understanding the ways of this land and our use of the water. Because that water was transportation, that water was we would drink it. We fished and ate fish from the water. And we had, it's a very special thing to us. And we did, I was looking at, thinking about all of what I was going to say tonight. And I know that I wanted to tell stories, but I also wanted to put those stories in context, like I have in this way, to help you understand and share perhaps some of the depth of feeling and the sense of this place that I have, and that my family has, and that our tribe has, and that many of our residents throughout the whole area have that same feeling, or have their own understanding of this. But we think of these things, and we think of them as a one of our things that we look at is we think of the water as it's the lifeblood of Mother Earth. That water, we all start our lives in our mother's womb in water, and the water is in the springs, the underground springs, and the veins through the earth, and that water is in the rain that comes. And that water is an essential part of life. And we think of it as the lifeblood of Mother Earth. And so it's a very sacred part of every day as we go through things. I have here a little copper cup, and I have water in it. And I use this whenever I do a pipe ceremony, or whenever we have a gathering together with our community. I use this because, well, it was a gift to me, and I want to tell you a little the story about that cup and how that came about in my life. And this is not a very old story. This is a relatively recent story. But it's our grandmothers. The protection of water and the stories of water are it's the responsibility of women in our culture, in the Native culture, to speak for that water and to protect the water. And one of the women who I know is a woman named Josephine Mindaman. And Josephine is a grandmother who lives in Thunder Bay, Ontario, up on Lake Superior. And she attends many of the lodge ceremonies in different places around, and she thinks about the water. She thinks about these things, and as we all do. But she told me that she could feel Mother Earth crying. She could feel the pain of the water. In the prayer that we had before our meal, that the mayor so aptly put about the pain that we've caused and the destruction that we've caused on earth and the different things that have happened, it isn't just something that's inconvenient, perhaps, that we can't drink the water, but all those other beings that we share this earth with suffer when we have those problems. When we put pollution or we do things in a water in such a way that it becomes, we can't drink it anymore. It's the lifeblood of Mother Earth, and yet we can't drink it. We can't go down to that river right out there and take a cup and get a drink. And it's directly because of things that we've done as people. And so this grandmother felt this pain and was trying to figure out what it was she could do. And what she did with several other grandmothers, several other Indian grandmothers, they got some water in a copper bucket. Copper is one of the Misquabec. It's red metal. It's one of the metals that we mined around here. They put water in that copper bucket, and they got a short staff that had eagle feathers tied to it that was prepared by one of the men. And those grandmothers, along with several people that helped them, they walked that bucket of water around Lake Superior. Took a long time. Took a lot of organization to do that. And they didn't walk where it was convenient. They walked right on the edge of the road because they wanted people to see them. They wanted people to ask questions. Why are they doing that? And they did this because they didn't know what else they could do. They didn't have a lot of power. They didn't have a lot of money. They didn't have much, but they did have themselves. They could put themselves out there. And that's what they did. They walked that water around Lake Superior. Well, as it turned out, they then walked for Lake Michigan the next year. And the year after that, they walked around Lake Huron. And the year after that, they walked Lakes Ontario and Erie. And when got all done with all that, they said, what are you going to do next? They said, well, I think we'll start over. Because in that trip, as they did that, they went to various places. One of the things they did is they came to our tribal community. And they gifted me with this copper cup to be sure that I would use this as I would talk to people about that issue. It has water in it. It has water that is that lifeblood of Mother Earth. It's our own lifeblood. And when they did this walk, it was a very special thing, and it did help bring people together to understand those issues. And they stopped and told stories. They did teachings about the traditional teachings of water. They stopped and did talking circles. They went to the Tip of the Mitt Watershed Council in Petoskey, Michigan, and they had all the staff from Tip of the Mitt and some community members get together in a big talking circle, and they talked about what it was they were doing and what the staff were doing. And they had a session in which many people cried because they hadn't really opened up in such a way like this, even though they worked every day with this type of thing. Something about the way that these people carrying this simple message around, it really reached people. I managed to get Governor Granholm to issue a proclamation on their behalf, which we presented them when they were in Petoskey. We also got the governor to intervene with the fully entrenched Mackinac Bridge Authority and get them permission to walk the wrong way across the bridge at a time when they weren't letting people walk across the bridge. But this was such an important message. They did, however, make us walk at 4 in the morning before there was a lot of traffic and before anybody would really see us doing it, because they were a little concerned that if we did it, everybody else would want to do it. So all of us here, I think, can fully understand bureaucracies. But we did get that support. And this was something that I actually spent some time walking with them. And I know that I'm a desk jockey. You know, I work with a computer and I work with a telephone. And these ladies were walking 4 miles an hour regularly from sunup to sundown. And they were in pretty good shape. So for those of us who weren't in such good shape, we really paid a price for our brief stint helping them carry that bucket or carry that staff. Now, in all of these things that we're talking about, this water, and I wanted to talk about the water walkers because that's something that's happening just right today. But also, right here by this river, in Grand Rapids, Michigan, the kind of things that we think about a lot, and what's got us in trouble a good deal throughout the modern day society, is that we've lost sight of something that's really important to us. Part of our traditional teachings, which I've been sharing with people wherever, in Washington or in Lansing, the state capital, or at various meetings, many of you have heard me speak of this before, and that is this concept of 7 generations. The idea that we're supposed to think through the consequences of our actions to that 7th generation. It's beyond somewhere where they're going to know our names necessarily, and we have to think about that. And if we create pollution that will never go away, it's going to accumulate. And people in coming generations are going to have to deal with it. We're dealing with stuff today that was created that we don't know what to do with. We have a hard time figuring out how to get rid of it. And it's causing persistent problems throughout the Great Lakes and throughout the whole world, as a matter of fact. But this concept of 7 generations is an idea that it's something that it isn't a matter of that you count out the generations in front of you. It's like driving down the road at night with your headlights shining ahead of you, and you can see a certain distance, and every 100 yards you go, your lights are going to go another 100 yards out down that road. Well, that's that 7 generations as a concept. It's a buffer in time out in front of us. It isn't a place that we reach, but it's a time period. It's a way of thinking about the world, thinking about the ramifications of our own actions. But there's another way to look at it too, and that is each one of us is someone's 7th generation. What did those people leave for us? Now, in my case, 7 generations ago, we were signing treaties. The Treaty of 1855 was the last treaty that my tribe signed, and that the tribe here from Grand Rapids area, the Grand River Band, signed. Just shy of 1 year ago, we had the 150th anniversary of the signing of that document. One of my good friends out here, Lee Sprague, was there, and was just literally across the street from here, a spot along the river where the gathering occurred, where that treaty was ratified. That Treaty of 1855 was actually ratified on July 29th, 1856, and it was right there where our tribal folks signed the version that came back from Washington. And in those treaties, what we did was, our ancestors worked hard to leave things for us today that we're using as tools to this very, right now, we're using them as tools to help us figure out how we're going to leave things for those coming generations yet. One of the tools that they left us was our ties to the natural resources, our legal tie to self-governance and ties to the rights and the jurisdictional issues about the natural resources. We've actually used those treaty rights and used that stuff that our ancestors put into words. We've been using that to help us move along the preservation and restoration of the Great Lakes. We moved this concept of the 7 generations. We've been in meetings throughout the whole Great Lakes Regional Collaboration in developing the plan. We helped in the we participated in those discussions on the Annex 2001 documents, both the Interstate Compact and the International Agreement. We helped work with the tribes in the United States and also the First Nations from Canada, working together. We all work together to try to help make this preservation and restoration something that would be real. And that's something that's not just for us, because if we work on something that cleans up our water as tribal people, it cleans up everybody's water. If we work on something that cleans up the air, it cleans up everybody's air. And so we're all in this together. We're all part of this one thing, and part of our gift that we're charged in our traditional ways with sharing is sharing these things, these teachings, and in trying to find ways to help ourselves and to help everyone. And it's a sacred duty for us to help protect Mother Earth and to protect all of those beings, including ourselves who live on it. I was once speaking, where was it? I think I spoke in a lot of different places. I don't always remember where I said something, but I know I said this. And I think it was down in Chicago, actually, when we signed the declaration for the collaboration, where I talked about the fact that when we talk about protecting the earth or saving the earth, it's sort of presumptuous on our part, because the earth operates in an entirely different timetable. The Creator's timetable is something that is way beyond something that's ours to even comprehend at times. What we're really doing when we're working about protecting the earth is we're protecting ourselves, because the earth is going to go on with us or without us. And what our situation is that we need to do what we can to help preserve a quality of life and help preserve that quality of our resources, not just because it's something that will help us live our own lives and help us share with each other, but because it's a duty to help protect all of life. And that's part of what we understand. Now, I think about Josephine Mindaman and what she did when she was walking, that she couldn't do an awful lot. But what are those things that each of us individually can do, those changes that we make ourselves? When I think about that, I talked about Josephine and the things that she could do, but, you know, I was down in the reception down here, and I was talking with Dave Ulrich, and he was telling me a story about something that he does on his lunch hour. And it reminded me of a story, and I asked him if I could tell him this, because tell this story here, because I actually didn't ask him. I told him I was going to, so I warned him in advance. Okay, but one of the things that I used to do is when I'd go for a walk in the woods is I'd pick up stuff. There'd be trash over here, and I'd pick that up a little bit, and then the next time I'd go for a walk, I wore a coat that had extra big pockets because there was a lot of junk out there. So I picked up some more, and, you know, I carried things, and eventually I'd start carrying a bag with me because there was a lot of junk out there. You know, and as I go for a walk, I'd pick stuff up, and pretty soon it wasn't so much fun to go for walks anymore. You know, because there was so much stuff to do. Well, when I talked with my father told me that there's a lot of things to do. You know, he was the one who taught me to pick stuff up when I went in the woods. But then he told me, he said, you know, Frank, you don't have to pick up everything. All you have to do is leave each place you go a little bit cleaner than it was when you got there. one gum wrapper, one old can, one something. Dave was telling me when he comes back from lunch, he's got a bottle on each finger. He's got 6 or 8 cans over here and all this stuff. I could just imagine him walking down the road with all this stuff. And it reminded me of this story that my father taught me. That while it's important that we work on cleanup, it's important that we do these things, it's also equally important that we maintain our sense of balance, and that we realize that although there's a lot of work to be done, it doesn't fall on each one of us to do all of it. But if we all work together and leave every place we find a little cleaner than it was when we found it, that is really what makes the world a better place. Anyway, I had that vision, Dave, when you were talking to me about all these things, these cans on each finger and all these other things, and it just occurred to me that now I know that I'm going to tell another story, and then I'm going to end this. I know it's late, and you guys have had a very long day, and you have a lot more time tomorrow yet. But I want to tell you this story, and this is a story that I learned from my father. There are similar stories from all over the world, but this is a story. It's Nana Beaujeu and the big fish, and it goes like this. Nana Beaujeu, who is one of our folk heroes, and he's in human form, but he has these abilities to do things that a lot of other people don't have. But Nana Beaujeu was walking along one day, and he was coming down to this village that was along the water. And as he came down to that village, some of the people came out of that village and said, Nana Beaujeu, you have to help us. We have a big problem. So they sat down, and he listened to them while they explained the problem. And they said, whenever we go out on that water, in our G-mon, in our canoes, whenever we go out on that water, we go out there because we fish, we go out there because we're going to visit our relatives that live out on the islands and other places. But whenever we go out there, there's this big fish that comes along, and it swamps our canoes, or people are drowning. We're having a lot of trouble when we're out on that water. And, well, can you help us? Well, Nana Beaujeu thought for a while, and he said, yes. He said, you fix me a big feast tonight. And then first thing in the morning, I'll get up, and I've got a plan, he said. I have a plan, and I'll help you. So Nana Beaujeu, they had that big feast, and the next day he got up, and now he had a G-mon, a canoe. And his canoe was a very special canoe because when you put it in the water, you didn't have to paddle. All you had to do was think which direction you wanted to go, and that canoe would go right in that direction. And Nana Beaujeu also had a war club. And his war club had such power that if he struck the earth, it'd shake. The whole earth would shake. And these are some of the things he took that war club, and he put that in that G-mon, in that canoe. And he took a big coil of wigobish. That's a cord made from the bark of a basswood tree. And he had a hook on the end of that. And he took that and he put that in that G-mon. And then he got it down at the edge of the water early in that day, and he sat down in that G-mon, and he thought it right out into the water. Now down deep in the water, there was this big fish that was swimming along deep in that water. And that fish sort of rolled over and looked up and saw that G-mon going across with no paddle and said, aha, I know who that is. That's Nana Beaujeu. I'm going to leave him alone. And Nana Beaujeu went out in that water, and he stopped. He had some bait, put a little bait on that hook, on that wigobish, and he threw that over the side, got his club ready, and he's just waiting. Now, I suspect that most of you in here have been fishing, and that probably most of you have suffered the fate that many people do when they're fishing, and that is they got a little bored. Well, Nana Beaujeu was waiting, and finally, he got a little bored. He couldn't wait any longer. And so he goes, hey, fish! Come get me, I'm Nana Beaujeu! Well, that fish looked up there and said, no way, I'm leaving you alone, he said. And that fish just kept on swimming. Well, Nana Beaujeu, he got bored again after a little while, and he yelled again to the fish. But this time, he started calling that fish some names. Now, you know when people do that sometimes somebody calls you a name, you may start getting a little angry or do something maybe that isn't in your own best interest, And that fish said, I think maybe I'll go up there and take care of that guy. And that fish started swimming up. Now, the water was really clear, and Ettawageshik could look down, and he could see way down in the water, he could see something coming. And so he got all ready. He said, oh, boy, I'm going to take care of this. He got his club ready, and that fish came up and came up and came up. And then Ettawageshik got a big surprise, because just when he's getting ready to do something, that fish just kept coming and opened its mouth really wide. It goes, had swallowed Ettawageshik and the canoe and the whole thing. And now that canoe is going down that fish's throat. And Ettawageshik's thinking, oh boy, how am I going to get out of this? And he's thinking, and then he thinks that canoe sideways right down in that fish's throat, so it won't go down any further. And now he's stuck in the throat of that fish. But that fish is swimming down in the water going, guess I fixed him. And he's swimming down low. Well, Ettawageshik's trying to figure out what he's going to do Finally got another idea. And he sort of stood up in that canoe, and he got that club, and he leaned back, and he goes, thump! And he hit that fish real hard right inside. And that fish is swimming along. Of course, now this is a really big fish, And that fish is swimming along, goes, little indigestion. Keeps right on swimming. Well, Ettawageshik looked at his club, and he goes, he's not used to that kind of thing happening. So he leaned back again, and thump, and he hit that fish again right inside. This time the fish got a little bit more uncomfortable, but kept right on swimming. Well, Ettawageshik leaned back this time, and with all of his might, just as hard as he could, thump, hit that fish just as hard as he could right inside. And that fish just died right there in the water. Now, you all know when a fish dies in the water, you know what happens. It floats. Well, that fish came up floating to the surface, and there's Ettawageshik still stuck inside. It's a pretty big fish. And what comes when you have a fish on the water? Ettawageshik, the seagulls. And Ettawageshik could hear them circling around up there, and the wind's blowing, and that big fish is blowing right over to the edge of the shore. And those seagulls are circling, and they're saying, oh, look at that feast down there. And Ettawageshik calls them down. He says, come here, my nephews and my brothers and my sisters, come here, he said. And he hollers out of that fish. He said, come down here and eat a hole in this fish so that I can get out. Well, they started eating, and pretty soon Ettawageshik could see a little bit of daylight, then a little more daylight. Pretty soon there's a great big hole inside of that fish. And Ettawageshik pulls that canoe, and he steps out. And that's how Ettawageshik killed the big fish. It made the water safe for us all to go out on. Oh. Now, I talked to you about how leaving the world just a little better than we found it, leaving things in a way that the thing that my father taught me, not trying to do everything at once, but leaving a little better than we found it. Well, one of the things that we did through the tribes and First Nations, and there were several people here who were in that meeting, is we called a meeting of all the tribes and First Nations in the Great Lakes Basin. There's approximately 185 tribes and First Nations throughout the Great Lakes Basin, each an independent government. And we, on fairly short notice, called a meeting and managed to get people. It was an unprecedented meeting. This meeting hadn't occurred in a similar meeting in several hundred years, actually, that we had this many people together. And we had 44 tribal chiefs, chairman, or Ogimuk in the meeting. And they represented a total of about 120 tribes and First Nations from the Great Lakes. And we signed the Tribal and First Nation Great Lakes Water Accord, in which we pledged to work together, and we pledged to work with the other governments, but we also asserted our rights and our jurisdiction as an important part of the restoration and preservation of the lakes. And at that meeting, there were several things that occurred at that meeting that were extremely important, one of which is that a pipe, one of our tribal pipes, and the pipe carrier, the man who carries that pipe, was there. The pipe that he carries is over 300 years old. It was at a ceremony in Montreal, 1701. It was at a ceremony between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabeg peoples, the Iroquois and the Ottawa, Chippewa, Potawatomi folks here from Michigan, at the end of a war that settled that war. It was also at another ceremony that settled a war between us and the Sioux tribes from out west. It was at several other peace treaties and other places of things. And then it was at this water accord. And of course it's had many different carriers over the years, and they tell the stories of this pipe. But it's part of those roots, that sense of place that is not just a story, but something that's physical, that carries through all those years. Well, the other thing that we did as we sent people on their way from this water accord meeting that was in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, is we got a great big bowl, and we had tied these little tobacco ties, like the one that I showed you, this little cloth that has the tobacco in it. And we had everybody who was at that meeting, and there were nearly 200 people at that meeting. We had everyone take one of those and take it home with them and have their thoughts and prayers in that. And then all of us, a day or so after we got home from this meeting, were to take that to the water and put those thoughts and prayers in the water. Not just in one spot, but throughout the entire Great Lakes. My challenge to you here today is to take that same thing. Take your thoughts and prayers about the water and about that lifeblood of Mother Earth, to take that home with you and to go to the water and put those thoughts and those concerns and those prayers into these waters that are the lifeblood for all of us, economically, spiritually, that are so important to all of us in our connections. That you take that home from this evening, you take that home from this conference, and you take those same kind of thoughts and put those in that water. And in doing so, all of us will be much stronger and a better place. And we will have left this place, this time, a little bit better than we found it. And with that, we'll continue our journey. G mana na 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 no den G mana na 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 gigo G mana na 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 no den G mana na 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 gigo. Miigwech, thank you.